Hello, greetings, students and viewers. So trying something new this week. I'm just literally going to be reading a chapter of the textbook on South Africa. And yeah, but basically for those of you who prefer podcasts, audio-visual methods of learning to just straight reading, it's another way of accessing obviously the exact same information. Just before I start, a word on note-taking. Just very briefly, I believe note-taking is an excellent way to learn material. Some people are very good at just hearing something or reading something and it stays. But personally, I strongly recommend note-taking. It helps me a lot. Obviously, it's there to refer to when it comes to revision. I think that there's different methods of note-taking. Some people like Cornell method. I have a particular method which I'll briefly outline in a moment. But the key for any method, I think, is that you should aim to capture in your notes a kind of combination of really key points. So a chapter might have, I mean, the way I tend to do it is try to kind of capture for each paragraph one basic point being made, the basic key point or argument of that paragraph, and then have some kind of secondary subpoints, possibly examples, things like that, so that in your notes, when you come to look at them again, there's some kind of there's a kind of almost a hierarchy of information in your notes. So there's kind of very key points, and then there's secondary points, perhaps written with a little indent, a little margin to show that they're kind of subsidiary points of that main point. What you don't want is like a long kind of list of just 50 bullet points or something like that. That's difficult to revise from. So yeah, I aim to kind of sum up a paragraph in one, not even a full sentence, a short phrase or something, and then indent a little bit, make a little margin for some extra detail. So you can kind of see at a glance the main point, but then you also have access to the extra detail when you come to look at your notes. The point, however, of making notes, it's not necessarily primarily to create a nice revision sheet. It's also, and perhaps the primary point of making notes, is to force you to process the information and to kind of think it through and to make sure you understand it. So what I tend to recommend for my students is maybe read a paragraph when you get kind of good at it and used to it, more familiar with it, want to challenge yourself a bit, maybe a couple of paragraphs. But I would start off, just read one paragraph, set the book aside, think what was the main point of that paragraph, jot it down, okay, and wonder what were the sort of secondary points, what were the examples they gave, and jot them down as well. And if you're not sure, you can always go back to the book, but try to make the notes whilst you're not looking at the book in the context of what we're doing here. So I will tell you when there's a new paragraph, and maybe you can pause the video and think, okay, what's just been said? What's the main point? What's the thrust of the point of what's just been said? Jot it down, add some further detail, move on. So that's my suggestion. Like I said, there are lots of different techniques of note-taking. Some people prefer much more visuals, sort of spider diagram, mind map type of things. There's Cornell note-taking that is worth looking up. It's similar to what I've suggested, but slightly more schematic. There's lots of different methods. You need to find a method that works for you. But the key point, like I say, is processing what you're hearing or reading, and kind of then explaining it yourself to make sure that you understand it. It's a way of engaging with the material rather than just passively taking it in. So without further ado, title of this chapter is "To What Extent Did Political Negotiations 1989 to 91 End in Compromise?" Okay, should I do a little bit of background? I mean, very briefly, I would say the 80s, really things are going out of control for the National Party. 1985 is a pivotal year. You've got the trade union movement, COSATU, organizing huge general strikes by the late 80s. 85 is for the first time the South African apartheid government, the National Party government, is starting to lose support from its key Western allies. British and American banks pull out, and that causes a massive currency crisis, with the rand losing a lot of its value. So the economy is starting to get hard hit for the first time by, you can call them sanctions, not necessarily morally motivated. A lot of this is investors, rich foreign investors, withdrawing their money because they're worried about the security of their investments, given things like the township revolts that are happening in the mid-80s. And you're even getting revolts and growing ANC activity even in the homelands, the rural areas, which had typically been not so much a hotbed of resistance previously in apartheid. So the townships completely out of control of the South African government by the late 80s, and even the homelands becoming so as well. Coup against the National Party allied leader in Transkei, Matanzima, a coup by an ANC-aligned military leader, Homalisa. So they're really losing control of the whole kind of black populated areas of the country, which of course the black African population is 80% of the country. So that's really, I would argue, the reason why investors start pulling out. Not really moral opposition to apartheid so much as they're worried about the security of their investments. The government appears to be losing control of the country. So that's the context for the negotiations that are going to be covered in this chapter. So in 1989, the system of apartheid was still in place, but it was in certain respects crumbling, and the government could not easily contain political opposition. The country was deeply divided, and this is important. This is me now talking, because the government was losing control. This caused splits in the ruling class and in the National Party, with some people saying we need to go in harder. Obviously, this would be people in the Verkrampte wing of the party, or who a lot of them have now split off into the Conservative Party, saying we need to go in harder, smash, crush the opposition and crush the unrest with a firmer grip. And then others saying, well, we've tried that. We can't just keep going on like that, and we're going to have to negotiate with the opposition forces, with the ANC, and reach some sort of negotiated settlement. So the National Party is increasingly divided over, well, what do we do? How do we restore stability? Is it through compromise? Is it through repression? And actually, the National Party is simultaneously doing both, as we will see. With the police and military behind them, the National Party still held strong cards. But the ANC, together with the MDM, that's the Mass Democratic Movement, which is basically the renamed UDF that had been banned in the late 80s, that kind of rebranded themselves as the Mass Democratic Movement with more involvement of the unions, COSATU and so on. The ANC, together with the MDM, had established a powerful position at the head of opposition forces. Political groupings such as Inkatha, this is, remember, the party of Chief Buthelezi, the Inkatha Freedom Party in Zulu, the KwaZulu-Natal homeland. So political groupings such as Inkatha, the PAC, we know, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the homeland governments, the Democratic Party, formerly known as the Progressive Party, the Coloured Labour Party, and the Conservatives represented a diversity of other interests. So that basically there's opposition in Parliament as well, right? These are groups who are, Parliament and across the country. Attempts to avoid further polarization and violence were going to need compromise on all sides. End of paragraph. May want to pause the video at this point, sum up what has just been said. It's the introduction, basically, to this chapter. Okay, subtitle 1, de Klerk's new course. In January 1989, Botha had been Prime Minister, remember, throughout the 80s up to that point. Botha suffered a stroke. Although the Nationalist Parliamentary Party had to some degree been sidelined, now what it means here, the Parliamentary Party had been sidelined because Botha had taken on powers himself directly, and remember, with the military increasingly. So increasingly he was governing without Parliament. Okay, so although the Nationalist Parliamentary Party had to some degree been sidelined, it still had a key role in selecting its leader, F.W. de Klerk, chairman of the Transvaal Provincial Party, who was voted in by a narrow margin. So they chose a new leader, right? National Party chose a new leader. In September 1989, white, coloured, and Indian voters cast votes for their separate parts of the tricameral parliament. De Klerk won the election with 48% of the white vote, and thus also became national president. So very polarized, the white population, right, at this point. De Klerk didn't even have the majority of the white votes in parliament. But the National Party received a shock in that this was its worst performance for many years, and white support for the Conservative Party peaked at 31.5%. So you got the Conservative Party from the right biting at the heels of the National Party, right? Trying to push them in a more authoritarian, repressive direction and stealing a lot of their votes. De Klerk won 94 seats compared to 39 for the Conservatives and 33 for the Liberal Democratic Party, inheritor of the Progressives. It just means the party that followed on from the Progressive Liberal Party, the Progressive Federal Party. De Klerk had been a cautious politician, a politically astute conservative, thoroughly embedded in the National Party. He was suspicious of the complex constitutional arrangements that Botha had performed under the reform agenda in the 1980s, and he was critical of Botha's presidentialism. This means Botha taking on this kind of more and more powers for himself as a president and taking powers away from the parliament, the elected parliament. So de Klerk was critical of that. De Klerk felt that the military and security forces had become too central in policy making, so he was opposed to this militarization that we've seen of government under Botha, bringing in the army into decision making, the State Security Council and so on. De Klerk quickly reduced military budgets, so he seems to be stepping away from the militarization of South Africa, reduced military budgets and curtailed the influence of the State Security Council and joint management systems at the end of 1989. Remember, the joint management centers were the regional bodies that basically took over local government and again combined some local elected politicians, but also army chiefs in each region, police chiefs in each region, part of the militarization we saw under Botha. So he's reversing this militarization to an extent, Botha is, in form at least. I'm just going to read the main part of the text. I'm not going to read all the sources and extra bits. So we'll continue. Botha, nicknamed the Groot Crocodile, big crocodile, had been forceful and ruthless. De Klerk was keener to find compromises and act as a political peacemaker. However, I would question that. We'll see what else they say. Maybe we'll come back to that point. However, the implications of pragmatic politics were by no means clear. Did this mean finding a route acceptable to African political movements and ending apartheid? De Klerk clearly wished to seize the political initiative from opposition forces, to keep his party at the forefront of political changes, to win backing from the Afrikaans press, which had become critical of Botha, and even find some international support. Okay, so he wants to overcome this division within white society, wants to reunite white society behind his agenda, but does that mean he's sincere about a genuine compromise? Let's read on. International political allies were slipping away, with conservative stalwarts, that just means kind of hardliners, such as Reagan, obviously president of the US in the 80s, and Thatcher, Prime Minister of Britain. These allies were beginning to pressure South Africa's leaders to negotiate. Remember, these US and Britain had been key supporters of South Africa all the way through the apartheid period. And now, really from the mid-80s, the first time they're putting serious pressure, economic pressure on them to negotiate, pulling out their funds and so on, saying, look, you've got to talk to the opposition, you've got to reach a settlement. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the end of communist influence in Europe. Okay, remember the international context, the Cold War. This is part of the reason the US and the UK had always supported South Africa, because South Africa was basically doing their dirty work in Africa, killing communists all over the region, killing revolutionary forces all over the region, Angola, Mozambique, etc. But the Cold War was winding down, right? Okay, so Gorbachev largely withdrew from Africa, and by late 1989, the Western need for a regional anti-communist policeman declined. And again, a lot of the communist forces in Southern Africa, places like Angola, Mozambique, were receiving funds and military training and weapons from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union in decline and actually on the verge of collapse, we now know, then there's the West starts to think, well, maybe there's less need to be so supportive of South Africa to combat them, because they're going to lose their support. They're going to have nowhere else to turn soon. Let's read on. Okay, next subheading, freeing Nelson Mandela and unbanning political parties. By mid-1989, it was clear that the ANC as a whole, barring some dissident voices, was committed to negotiations. Key ANC political prisoners, including Walter Sisulu, Raymond Malaba, and Ahmed Kathrada, were freed in October 1989. De Klerk and Mandela met in December 1989. Remember, Mandela by this point is on the mainland. He's off Robben Island, and he's even living in his own house within a prison compound. Anyway, de Klerk and Mandela met in December 1989, and Mandela released a forceful statement arguing for a negotiated settlement. On its side, the National Party's only real alternative was to go back to some form of white domination, face tightening international sanctions, and try to repress an endless future of mass protests. Despite the conservative backlash, the bulk of whites no longer really supported apartheid as a formal policy and sought some other security for their future. Whites had done well under apartheid, and they had too much to lose in a civil conflict. Negotiations seemed inevitable. So the whole of white society, or a large portion at least, and they're suggesting the majority of white society is starting to think we have to negotiate, because otherwise it's going to be constant civil war, the government unable to control vast swathes of the country, economic disaster because no one wants to invest because of this instability. We're just going to have to negotiate with the black forces and their leadership, the ANC. When de Klerk opened Parliament in February 1990, he did resort to a form of presidentialism. Again, this just means really the president having more powers than as an individual than the Parliament as an elected body. That's really what we mean by presidentialism. So de Klerk resorted to a form of presidentialism, having criticized Botha's presidentialism, taking too much power in his own hands. He's actually now doing the same. Before consulting the new parliament, he announced that he would release Mandela and unban the political parties that had been prohibited within South Africa, including the ANC, the Communist Party, and the PAC. So he doesn't want to risk Parliament rejecting this, right? He just announced it. He does it before the Parliament's even open, because he doesn't want to cause a big divide and risk them actually blocking it. Because remember, over 30% of the vote has been won by the Conservatives, or hardliners, who are still just on a smash the ANC tip. They don't want negotiations, etc. Mandela's slow walk to freedom in the unlikely rural surrounds of Victor Verster prison grounds, hand held high with Winnie Mandela, his wife, was televised internationally and provided a moment of religious intensity and political hope. Massive moment. Remember, all through the 80s and from the late 70s, the main slogan of the anti-apartheid movement internationally had been Free Nelson Mandela. Specials had a top 10 hit in Britain. Look it up on YouTube. Lovely song, Free Nelson Mandela. And here he was, finally freed. Really significant moment. Nice to watch his speech, by the way, on YouTube. You can find it easily. Very, very nice moment. Mandela seemed to carry the promise of salvation. He could save the country from the mess it was in. Next paragraph. The ANC, for so long reliant upon clandestine activism, I mean underground, because they were illegal, so everything had to be covert and underground, was now able to organize publicly and establish itself as the legitimate alternative for a future South Africa. After how many years? That's like 3 decades of being banned. They were now finally able to come out into the open. They could have legal members, legal rallies, meetings, newspapers, etc. After his release, Mandela addressed a series of meetings. The first, a rushed and poorly organized event on Cape Town's Grand Parade. They've missed an important thing out. I should tell you, if you see Mandela's speech, the amazing thing, I think, so this is February, I think, February 1990. And he comes out, he's been released. But then there's been no conclusion to any negotiations. Negotiations are only in the very, very early stages with the government. And remember, he'd rejected all these offers of conditional release before, Mandela. This was an unconditional release. So he hadn't rejected the armed struggle. So he comes out and he announces to this rally. It's amazing when you think about it. He's been released from prison by de Klerk. And his message to the huge numbers of people there is, let's step up the armed struggle. Yeah. So it's an amazing situation. He's saying, look, we've not reached any agreement. Apartheid is still there. Okay, some of it's falling apart. The past laws have kind of falling apart. But there's still, black people don't have the vote. They still don't have the democratic rights. They're still considered aliens in their own country because they're considered citizens of these different homelands and not of a united South Africa. So they say, look, all of the conditions that led to the arms, okay, well, I'm banned and I'm free, but apartheid is still there. We need to step up the armed struggle because, this isn't over. So amazing situation. Okay. The first meeting, a rushed and poorly organized event on Cape Town's Grand Parade, was dwarfed by the second before a crowd of 120,000 in Soweto's FNB Stadium. Despite being shielded from the glare of publicity for nearly 3 decades, Mandela had sufficient self-confidence and inner strength to cope with a demanding schedule as well as handling the world's media. Over the next few months, he spent much of his time traveling and trying to coordinate the ANC's response to its unbanning. The exiled Thabo Mbeki, who dealt with external relations, also established himself as a key strategist. Thabo Mbeki would go on to become president later, after Mandela, by the way. Mandela visited the United Kingdom twice in this period. It was a hub for the ANC in exile and for the global anti-apartheid movement. This is by the by for this topic, but it's interesting from the point of view of Britain. Some of you may have heard of Stephen Lawrence, black teenager who was murdered by a gang of racists in London in I forget the date, early 90s, 93, I think. One of his visits, Mandela, to London, he made contact with the Stephen Lawrence family just 2 weeks after the murder. In this 2 weeks, the police had failed to follow up any of the leads. They'd been given copious leads. They'd been given the name, address, witness statements of the attack, and had done nothing with it. We later found out that there was very likely corruption involved, that one of the murderer's fathers was actually paying off the police. He needn't have bothered because the police were racist anyway and probably wouldn't have followed it up anyway. Anyway, they did nothing about this racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. Mandela met Stephen Lawrence's parents because some of the key organizers of the anti-apartheid movement in London, people like Mark Wadsworth, were also active in the Justice for Stephen Lawrence campaign. And they said, Mandela, could you meet this family? They need some support. And Mandela met them. And he came out and all the press were there. The press had shown no interest in the Stephen Lawrence murder before. No one heard of Stephen Lawrence. But when Mandela's visit was a big occasion, and so when he met the Lawrence family, suddenly Stephen Lawrence became an issue, right? And came after the meeting. He came out and he said to the press, he said, "I didn't expect coming to Britain that black lives would be as cheap here as they are in South Africa. It was really not the message that the UK government were hoping he would convey." And that's what really Mandela's visit is really what put Stephen Lawrence on the map. And that led to the whole Stephen Lawrence inquiry, which was the first time that the Metropolitan Police were labelled by the government's own report institutionally racist. So a really pivotal moment in British race relations, triggered by Mandela's visit and meeting the Lawrence family. Anyway, there's by the by for us here, but a very significant bit of British history. Anyway, okay. In April 1990, Mandela visited London for a second televised concert, which again reached an estimated global audience of 500 million people. This was to celebrate his release, and he received an 8-minute standing ovation. He also made an extended speech. Although he himself was keen to meet Margaret Thatcher, the ANC was adamantly opposed. Interesting, because the ANC considered Thatcher, she was not their friend. Her opposition to the liberation movements, her consistent opposition to sanctions, which of course the ANC had been calling for many, many years, and her support for other black politicians such as Chief Buthelezi, who remember by this time was effectively at war with the ANC, left a bitter taste. Mandela, however, insisted and did meet Thatcher in July 1990. He was keen to talk to opponents and believed that it was vital to do so, although the issue of sanctions still separated them. With Tambo ill, Mandela became acting president of the ANC, and in July 1991, this is a new paragraph, by the way, he was formally elected to this position. Cyril Ramaphosa, the trade unionist and current president, by the way, of South Africa, as we speak in 2023, Cyril Ramaphosa, the trade unionist, who's leader of the miners' union, was elected Secretary General of the ANC. This was a significant attempt to bring the COSATU, remember that's the trade union movement, and UDF movements into the heart of the ANC. So they're trying to make sure that key figures from the mass movement, the UDF, and the trade union movement, COSATU, are actually part of the ANC. So the ANC is genuinely representative of all of these mass opposition forces. The movement had recruited 700,000 members, so UDF, way beyond any previous figure. This was achieved, what's going on? Through the folding of the UDF and the MDM into the ANC. So that once the ANC was unbanned, the Mass Democratic Movement, the United Democratic Front, basically shut up shop and said, look, we'll just go into the ANC. Let's just become part with the ANC now. They continued as parallel movements during 1990, but did not envisage a separate future. The ANC was founding branches in South Africa, and most supporters of the UDF joined these. In March 1991, the UDF decided to disband and held its last meeting in August. An alternative strategy did not seem feasible at the time, but in the medium term, this decision weakened grassroots political organization in the country, and it may have been wiser for the UDF to think of forming a separate wing of the alliance similar to COSATU. In 1990, an organization called the South African National Civic Organization, headed by Moses Mayakiso, was founded to provide a vehicle for the remaining civic and residents associations that had sprung up so widely in the 1980s, but it proved to be relatively weak and disorganized. The ANC, this new paragraph, also absorbed many of the youthful comrades, not least through the agency of Peter Mokaba. Born in 1959, he participated in the school protests of the 1970s and was another product of Turfloop, the powerhouse of African student politics. If you remember, that's the University of the North, a homeland university, interestingly, from which Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness movement emerged in the late 60s. Mokaba, a close associate of Winnie Mandela, joined the UDF and emerged by 1987 as the leading figure in the South African Youth Congress, which attempted to maintain the momentum of youth organization amid mass arrests. A charismatic public speaker who used radical rhetoric, he was arrested and imprisoned twice. He called the Comrades movement the Young Lions from Isaiah in the Bible, and in the early 1990s used the chant, "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer," at mass meetings. Translation, Dubul Ibhuna. Not sure about the pronunciation. Apologies if I got that wrong. This came from a liberation movement song, and ANC spokesman justified its use as metaphorical. The ANC Youth League, which had been so important a radical vehicle in the 1940s and 50s, had faded in exile. Youth who left the country were largely absorbed into MK. Mokaba played a key role in transforming the youth and student organizations into a revived ANC Youth League. So, right, point of that paragraph, Peter Mokaba, important figure, revived ANC Youth League, very radical. Similarly, the ANC moved to incorporate traditional authorities into its broad umbrella through the organization of Contralisa, CONTRALESA, in 1987. This provided a vehicle for chiefs who were sympathetic to the UDF or had hedged their bets in the homeland period and now saw the writing on the wall. In other words, they realized the ANC was going to come to power. They realized apartheid was going to end. And so the ANC sought to actually kind of bring them into the discussion, make sure they didn't end up being enemies, and so on. I'm getting some nice comments. That's nice. Oh, thanks for these. You're very welcome. You're all very welcome. Lovely. Thank you. Okay. Where are we? So they wanted this organization to bring chiefs of the within the various homelands into discussions so that they wouldn't be spoilers in any future negotiated settlement, basically. So Contralisa, Mandela, among others, was keen to prize chiefs away from the apartheid regime and felt they would add support to the ANC in the rural areas. When he spoke to 100,000 people at a Welcome Home event in Transkei in 1990, Mandela told the chiefs they had a role as long as they broadly supported the liberation movement. Thus, by 1991, the ANC had successfully absorbed some of the key popular opposition forces. So if we just think what we've just learned there, they've brought the UDF and MDM into the into the ANC. Most of the members of those movements joined the ANC. They've invited key figures within those movements brought them into leading positions within the ANC. So that's kind of incorporated that element of the mass struggle. They've had people like Cyril Ramaphosa from COSATU into leading position, Secretary General, and they're bringing the trade union movement into the ANC. They're even bringing chiefs within the homelands who, remember, previously a lot of them had been seen as collaborators with apartheid, but they're bringing them in. They say, listen, the past is history. If you broadly welcome the direction we're now going in, you're welcome as well. Work with us. Let's make a future together. So they're bringing in all of these different forces into ANC. The youth leagues revived, and so on. Okay. Next subheading: negotiations and dismantling apartheid. And I think this is this the last? Oh no, a couple more. Okay. Mandela called de Klerk a man of integrity during his first public address, but negotiations were delayed. Although Mandela talked to de Klerk privately, it was only in May 1990 that full negotiating teams met. De Klerk, it transpired, was not in a hurry. The National Party perceived that protracted negotiations would favor them. So they're dragging their feet, the National Party, right? They said, yeah, we'll negotiate, but it's not going anywhere. They believed that there were likely to be splits in the complex opposition alliance that included the ANC, the Communist Party, COSATU, Trade Union Congress, and the UDF/MDM. So the National Party is hoping if they drag it out, then splits will emerge within their opponents. So they're not negotiating good faith. It becomes increasingly clear. This is why I questioned the characterization in the book earlier on of de Klerk as a peacemaker. Anyway, one of the reasons. Many whites held the view, strongly encouraged by the homeland policy under apartheid, that African loyalties were primarily ethnic or tribal. They were encouraged to believe that African people would divide on ethnic lines and perceived that violent conflict within African communities, black on black violence as it was called, that old stereotype, was at least in part a result of this. In actual fact, a lot of the so-called black on black violence was political, and a lot of it was sponsored, we now know, from the Truth and Reconciliation hearings that came after apartheid. A lot of that violence was sponsored by the National Party covertly, who were putting money and weapons into vigilante groups formed under Inkatha to attack and kill ANC members. So the National Party is literally paying black collaborators to kill black liberation movement fighters, and then they're portraying it to the white population as, oh, look at these age-old ethnic rivalries, ingrained violence in black communities, classic white supremacist divide and rule strategy. National Party leaders had by this time recognized that the ANC commanded the largest support among black people. But the intensification of conflict in KwaZulu and Natal, this is where Inkatha and secretly being funded by the National Party were increasingly at war with ANC and UDF comrades, as well as on the Rand, encouraged them to think that black communities were divided. They still saw promise in Buthelezi and some other moderate black politicians, including homeland leaders, and in colored and Indian politicians who had bought into the reform process. So there's still some delusions in the white population that they can somehow keep the ANC at bay. Maybe they don't really represent that mainstream of black opinion. Maybe there's still some sort of, some forces that we can work with who are not so hostile to white supremacy and so on. Alan Hendricks's Labour Party, which had participated in the coloured parliamentary election in 1989 and won an easy victory, seemed to command considerable support in the Western Cape. Although no political settlement seemed imminent, in June 1990, de Klerk revoked some racial legislation, such as the Separate Reservation of Amenities Act. Breaches of the Group Areas Act were policed less fiercely. Hillbrow, an area of high-rise residential flats immediately to the north of Johannesburg city centre, was defined as a white group area, but the government allowed it to become a mixed, or grey as they called it, area. Okay. So they're allowing some mixed areas for the first time. Remember, the Group Areas Act had strictly zoned every square centimeter of the country into either for Black Africans, whites, Indians, or so-called coloreds. So now they're allowing a fifth zone, a mixed zone, for the first time. The ANC compromised in turn by suspending the armed struggle in August 1990. Right, so this is the first time since they took up arms in 1961 that they're now saying, okay, good faith negotiations, okay, we'll suspend the armed struggle. The ANC delegations which met the government included key exiles such as Thabo Mbeki, as well as former prisoners and a few local activists. De Klerk saw his preparedness to accept Communist Party delegates such as Joe Slovo as a significant compromise. He admitted that the system of separate development had not worked, but he did not apologize for apartheid. This is de Klerk's major concern was for the ANC to publicly reject sanctions, but they refused to do so. So he said, okay, that's good, you've suspended the armed struggle, now let's tell the international community to start trading with us again. Mandela said no. Having suspended the armed struggle, the ANC felt that sanctions remained an important negotiating tool. They had at this point received no promises from the National Party about the shape of the future political system. There's an amazing three-part documentary, by the way, about this whole period, about the period from 85 to 94. It's probably the best use of 2.25 hours if you're looking at this period in apartheid. I'm just trying to get the name of the video up for you quickly. Sorry, my computer's being low. Okay, I'll continue whilst I'm doing this. Multitask. Next paragraph. The ANC was keen to ensure freedom for political exiles and political prisoners. They thought that this had been assured. De Klerk agreed to lift the state of emergency in 1990. Remember, the state of emergency had been in place since the mid-80s in the context of the township revolt. It was initially just in some townships and then made nationwide in, I think, 86. But soon afterwards, in an apparently contradictory act, de Klerk arrested key members of the CP, that's the Communist Party, and MK. The government gave as their reason that the ANC had reneged on its promise to suspend the armed struggle because they had not fully disbanded Operation Vula. This was a big controversy. Operation Vula was an operation to infiltrate back into South Africa large number of MK fighters. Tells us a bit more about it here. This was an underground initiative started in 1988, designed to resurrect the MK presence within the country, and with improved sea communications to establish a more secure organizational structure with a steady supply of weaponry. So the National Party argued that the ANC's suspension of the armed struggle was in bad faith because they suspended the armed struggle, they weren't doing any more attacks, bombings, etc., but they were infiltrating more and more fighters and weapons into the country. Okay, the ANC argued publicly that they had suspended, not abandoned, armed struggle and wanted to be ready to resume should negotiations break down. So, sorry, I'm still trying to find the name of this video. Okay. Including Robben Island prison for many, many years, key leader in the ANC and in MK. He was arrested, and this was designed also to split the ANC from the Communist Party and disrupt the imminent relaunch of the Communist Party in South Africa. Only in March 1991 were all charges withdrawn, and those still underground indemnified against further government action. Finally found the name of this video. It's called Nelson Mandela's Fight for Freedom - best documentary. If you search for that, that's what it's called on YouTube. It's actually a 3-part documentary. Originally it was broadcast as The Death of Apartheid, and it's great. It's really gives you a really good insight, really interesting footage. Starts with the pivotal year of 1985, the township revolt, the withdrawal of international banks and loans and so on. And yeah, it's just excellent. Interviews of real key players, shows the negotiations, all the ups and downs in the negotiations. Highly, highly recommended. Okay. This was one disagreement that undermined negotiations. Disagreement about responsibility for violence within black communities was another. So they're going through the different sticking points in the negotiations, right? So one was the uncovering of Operation Vula, National Party saying that it was showed that this ANC weren't so sincere in suspending the armed struggle, and then making arrests that obviously angered the ANC. So that was one sticking point. Second sticking point, this issue of the so-called black on black violence. Okay, so Mandela and Buthelezi met in early 1991 in order to try and stem the violence in Natal. An accord was reached, but neither side adhered to it. In March 1991, 45 people were killed in 3 days of fighting between hostel dwellers and comrades in Alexandra, Johannesburg. Hostel dwellers, these are young men who are working often in mines. They're away from their families, susceptible to often being recruited into gangs and so on. It's because basically they need workers in the mines. Black Africans are not allowed to basically live near the mines with their families. They're supposed to be in the homelands. And so they had these hostels for what were termed migrant laborers. So young men, they would stay in these hostels whilst they're working the mines for months and maybe 6 months at a time. Then they go back to see their families in the homelands for a week or something and then come back. So a lot of frustrated, angry young men, often, drowning their upset and frustration with drink and so on, often recruited into gangs. And a lot of them were being, again, recruited covertly by government paramilitary groups to go and attack ANC and so on. So that's what it means by hostile dwellers. Okay. Soon after that, police killed a further 12 people on the East Rand. So the point is, even whilst negotiations are going on, violence is escalating still. Violence is escalating on both sides, and like I say, the National Party is increasingly using and recruiting covertly black organizations, criminals, elements of the Inkatha Freedom Party to go and actually kill and attack ANC members. So this is all happening whilst their leaders are in the room negotiating. This is all happening behind the scenes, if you like. In April 1991, ANC relations with the government reached a low point when Mandela accused de Klerk of colluding with or even orchestrating the violence by police and vigilantes in order to divide black society and justify government control. The term third force was used by the ANC to describe this hidden network of provocateurs linked to government security forces. So there's literally government intelligence security forces organizing these networks of gangs and people to go and kill and attack ANC supporters. Evidence emerged at this time. There's a great book on all of this, the death squads that were being organized by the National Party at this time. I forget the name, but it's in, those of you who are my students at Spires, is in the library in the South Africa section. Evidence emerged at this time that Inkatha supporters were trained directly by the South African government. Here you go. The ANC suspended talks. So this was the second sticking point, and the ANC walked out at this point. They said, look, you're negotiating with us, and then you're literally going and paying people to go and torture and kill us outside in the streets. You're not sincere. You're not serious. We're out. De Klerk tried to maintain the momentum, and in June 1991, revoked the Population Registration Act, the Native Land Act, and the Group Areas Act. So this is major. These are major planks of apartheid that are now being repealed. So apartheid is being dismantled, but there's still this fear amongst white society and the National Party of actually allowing a fully democratic system in which the ANC might be elected and become the government. So this is really, so it looks from a simplistic reading, you can think, Mandela's release, the repeal of these laws, is kind of just a nice gradual path to the end of apartheid. But actually at the time, it wasn't like that. There was this real fear of democracy, which would lead to ANC rule, which who knows what would that lead to. The ANC in the white imagination were terrorists, communists, not to be trusted. And now faced with the prospect of them becoming the government, they just couldn't countenance it. So this was a major sticking point. It says, however, and here you go, there was still an atmosphere of deep suspicion between the ANC and the National Party. Okay, last paragraph on what's called Codessa, which is the multi-party talks that were convened in 1991. Mandela had ceased to trust de Klerk, and the latter clearly found the ANC uncompromising. After the early promise of talks about talks, so the early talks were about what is going to be the structure, formal structure of the negotiations. That's when they mean talks about talks. All parties, including Buthelezi, felt they were being asked to give up too much. Nevertheless, all did agree to a first round of formal negotiations at the end of 1991 in a process called the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA. They met in the anodyne environment, kind of boring, what's the word, sort of synthetic environment of the World Trade Center in Johannesburg, near an airport which was then called Jan Smuts Airport, but would shortly be named O.R. Tambo Airport, after Oliver Tambo. The South African process was distinctive in that it did not involve external mediation, and it incorporated a very wide range of political groupings. The public proceedings, at least, were not simply a negotiation between the ANC and the National Party. Lots of different parties were involved, right? The government's central aim was still to devise a constitutional strategy that might protect minorities, by which they mean whites and particularly white economic interests. That's my reading of it. And ideally create a constitutional veto in the hands of whites. So the National Party were keen to ensure that whatever form of democracy, they would still be able to have some sort of veto. That's what they meant by minority rights. White people were less than 20% of the South African population, but they were still terrified of black majority rule. So they wanted to have a veto over anything the ANC did. So that's where we'll leave that for now. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that. This is where it gets really interesting. Fully recommend that documentary, by the way, Nelson Mandela's Fight for Freedom. Really interesting stuff on the negotiations, really interesting. So yeah, I do recommend that. And yes, thank you again, and thanks for the these comments. Thank you. William Atkin says thanks for the political ideas videos, really helpful. You're very welcome. I'm glad they're of use. Wolfie Dude 14 says thanks for the stream. In university now, still find your videos interesting and useful for learning. Oh, thank you. That's nice. J98, thanks for carrying me through my A levels last year. That's nice to hear. Thank you. That's really nice. Thank you for the appreciation. It was a tough time, but your politics videos were so helpful. Thank you, brother. Nikki Sushak, hi, can you do a video on STV, SV, AMS, and FPTP? Well, that sounds long. I'm not sure I can. I may do. I may do. We'll see. For EdXL A level, I actually teach EdX A level, but I teach for history, but I do AQA for politics, but it's very similar. Have I not done a video on voting systems? Maybe I haven't. Maybe I should. Maybe it's not a bad idea. I'll look into it. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye for now.